I'm sure all of us at some point have been traveling, maybe somewhere we've never been before, and we see go over a rise. Maybe it's mountains, maybe it's a great big plain, maybe it's a beautiful waterfall, and it just kind of takes your breath away. And you look out and you just go, wow. And you marvel at it. I remember when, I guess it's been a year and a half ago, my family and I went to Colorado. We'd never been to Colorado before, driving through the mountains, and some of those sights there. Of course, Elizabeth wasn't looking, the kids and Elizabeth, their eyes were closed, but just the views, the drop-offs were gorgeous. It's beautiful. You just kind of take your breath away when you're looking out. You stop and take as many pictures as you can. And it's one of those things where it's just kind of, it's just, first of all, certainly appreciate the majesty of the creation of God. But you go, wow, I've just never seen anything like that before. Maybe it's a beautiful lake with beautiful trees and hills. Maybe it's up on top of mountains looking down, you can see the top of clouds. And you just go, wow. You don't see that every day. But then, on the flip side, maybe you're driving, especially on a long drive, and you see just nothing. Dull, boring. I'm not going to make any jokes about driving through Oklahoma or anywhere else. Just dull, flat, boring, nothing to look at, nothing to see. And that's just all there is to look at. Especially now with it cold, there's no leaves on any trees. It's just kind of, and it's just really, really long drive. So you go from those two extremes sometimes, maybe even on the same trip. You go from being awestruck and marveling at what you're seeing to being, there's just nothing here. Well, this morning I'd like to ask you a question. Relating this to a spiritual concept, is our faith marvel worthy? And we're going to look at this. There's going to be two examples of great faith that we want to look at in the New Testament. The only two times where Jesus marvels at somebody's faith. And then we're going to look at an example of the opposite of that. The first example we want to consider, we're going to go to Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 1. Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 1, one of our daily devotionals this week was looking at the unnamed centurion and marveling at his faith that this man had. We looked at the Matthew account and Matthew chapter 8 in our devotional. Today we're going to look at the Luke account, because Luke kind of gives us a little bit some other details here regarding kind of what the interaction between Jesus and this man was. Matthew records that the centurion came to Jesus. Luke tells us that it was the servants of the centurion, which is the same as saying the centurion himself, but it was through his servants that he's sending information. But we have a little bit of background, at least in terms of maybe where this man has at least a little bit of knowledge. In Luke chapter 7 and in verse 1, this is talking about Jesus. Now, when he concluded all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. And a certain centurion's servant, who was dear to him, was sick and ready to die. So when he heard about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. How did he hear about Jesus? I have no idea. I don't know who he heard it from, how he heard it, but he heard about Jesus. And obviously he heard about the power that Jesus had, because he sent, first of all, the elders of the Jews to Jesus to basically plead on his behalf. Now, I think it's really interesting because we have here a great deal of wisdom from the centurion. Because remember, the centurion, he's a Gentile. He's not a Jew. And this centurion, certainly not being a Jew, he doesn't have perhaps that background, although he does have some appreciation of the Jewish people we're going to learn. So apparently he at least has some knowledge and understanding of the Jewish people, perhaps even some knowledge and understanding, obviously, of Jehovah. But he sends the Jewish elders to Jesus to talk to him. He doesn't come personally, and he doesn't even send Gentile servants. He sends people that were Jesus' people in the flesh. He sends the Jewish elders. And in verse 4, when they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly saying that the one for whom he should do this was deserving. Even these Jewish elders, who generally the Jews were not fond of the Romans in any form or fashion, especially Roman servants, government officers, and individuals who worked for the government, they weren't very fond of those. Remember last week we talked about Zacchaeus. He was a Jew, and yet he was also a tax collector, and the people didn't like him because of that. But here we have Jewish elders pleading on behalf of a centurion and saying he's worthy. Well, what all has he done? Verse 5, for he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue, presumably there in Capernaum. So this is a man who appreciates and cares for the Jewish people. Again, whether or not he's actually a Jewish proselyte or has ever even come that far, we don't know any about that. But we do know he cares about the Jewish people. He even went so far as to build a synagogue for the Jews. And then in verse 6, Jesus went with them. And when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Well, just as Matthew records, Jesus is going to enter into the house, and the centurion, we find out here in the account of Luke, through his friends, says, Lord, I'm not worthy that you should come into my house. Notice the humility of this man. I'm not worthy. Even though the Jewish elders say he's deserving of this, of receiving this gift of having his servant healed, despite that, the centurion himself does not view himself as worthy. But then in verse 7, but say the word, and my servant will be healed. Now, again, we don't know how the centurion heard about Jesus, but I would suggest this. I would suggest that he probably has not seen a miracle done by Jesus. He's heard about it. I suggest he's heard about Jesus, he's heard about the miracles. He hasn't actually seen one done. But the majority of the time, in fact, and only a few examples, in fact, the majority of the time where Jesus heals someone or does a miracle, he's actually in the presence of that individual being healed. Only a handful of times is it not that way, where Jesus simply has to say a word, and then some distance away, maybe even miles away, this person is healed. And I would suggest that there's no, I don't know that the centurion has heard of these examples. He knows Jesus has the power to heal, but I suggest that his belief, his faith, that all Jesus has to do is but say a word, comes from the very next statement that he offers. In verse 8, for I also am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes. To another, come, he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. And whether there was any more dialogue here between this man, i.e. his friends, and Jesus, we're not told. But what we see next is Jesus marveling at this man's faith. Now I suggest that this man, because of the very fact that Jesus had the power of God, whether or not the centurion had ever heard of an instance where Jesus was able to heal remotely, to heal somebody from a distance away, is irrelevant. The fact that this man knew he had the power of God, that represented authority. That authority doesn't have boundaries. That authority isn't bound by distance. All you have to do is say the word, because you have authority to have it done. And it'll be done. Whether you're 2 feet away or 200 miles away, doesn't make any difference. Authority is authority. Power is power. That was the conviction that this man had. He was absolutely convicted. You don't need to come into my house because I'm not worthy. And I know you don't need to be in the presence of my servant to heal him because you have authority and you have power. So how do we see Jesus respond? In verse 9, when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him. He turned around and said to the crowd that followed him, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. Now, this is as much an implication against Israel as it is a vindication of the faith of this centurion. This is a centurion who was not of the Jewish people. And of all people, you would expect Israel and the Jews to have such great conviction. And yet here's a centurion, a Roman, who has absolute conviction of the ability of Jesus. And when he turns to the crowd, he says, here's this centurion with such wonderful, great faith. This term marvel is often translated to wonder, not wander, wonder. Something that is wondrous. It's awe-worthy, praiseworthy. This is what Jesus is referring to with regard to or this is what I guess you could say Luke is referring to with regard to the faith of this centurion that Jesus observes. That Jesus marveled. He wondered at the faith of this centurion, the conviction that this man had. Now, the Matthew account gives us a little bit more dialogue of what Jesus says after he refers to this great faith. In Matthew chapter 8, in verse 10, this is after Jesus hears the centurion say, you have authority, all you need to do is say the word. Just, I have authority, I say go do something, a servant doesn't. Verse 10 of Matthew chapter 8, when Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to those who followed, assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. Verse 11, and I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Notice Jesus expressly makes a connection between the faith of this centurion being a Gentile versus the lack of conviction of among many of the Jews. He refers to many coming from the east and the west. He's referring to people who aren't Jews. These are Gentiles. They will come and they will sit down. Jesus uses this phrase to communicate a sense of dwelling with, of abiding with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now that phrase should ring bells because throughout the Old Testament, constantly God was referring to himself as, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the fathers of the Jews. But Jesus, he doesn't specifically reference Jehovah here, but by implication, that is the association. They will come and sit with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and who else? All of those who have such great faith like this centurion. Just like this centurion, if you've got great faith, you too will be able to dwell with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Whereas, what does he say in verse 12? The sons of the kingdom? The natural grown root, which is the Jews, they were born into the oracles of God. They were taught the prophecies. They were taught the law. They were circumcised according to the law. Those who don't have such great faith, they will be cast into outer darkness. Weeping and gnashing of teeth, referring to condemnation, judgment. And then in verse 13, Jesus said to the centurion, we know Luke, as Luke records to us, the friends of the centurion, to pass this dialogue along, Jesus said to the centurion, go your way. As you have believed, so let it be done for you. And his servant was healed that same hour. The absolute conviction of this centurion should send chills down our spine because there was no doubt in this man's mind as to the authority and power that Jesus wielded. Let me show you another example. In Matthew chapter 15 and in verse 21. Matthew chapter 15 and verse 21. We have a parallel account in Mark chapter 7, starting in verse 24. We're not going to go to the Mark 7 account. It's almost verbatim, the exact same situation, same account. But in Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse 21, we're introduced to an unnamed Canaanite woman. Starting in verse 21, Jesus went out from there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, have mercy on me, O Lord, son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed. Verse 23, but he answered her, Jesus, he answered her not a word. His disciples came and urged him, saying, send her away, for she cries out after us. Now, I think it's interesting that this isn't just happening one time. She doesn't just say this once. It sounds like she's doing this repeatedly. And it's kind of a constant as she's following him. Son of David, please hear me. Please fulfill my request. And it's to the point that the disciples are getting annoyed with it. And they say in verse 23, send her away because she keeps crying out after us. She's following us around, crying out for this. Notice Jesus still doesn't respond to her. He responds to the disciples in verse 24. He said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I wasn't sent to the Gentiles, which tells us that this Canaanite woman, which we're already told she was a Canaanite woman. In fact, one thing Mark records for us a little bit more detail is exactly where she was from. She was Greek. But Jesus says, I wasn't sent to the Gentiles. I was sent to the lost sheep of Israel. So he hasn't turned to her yet. Now, this isn't Jesus being racist. This isn't Jesus being showing favoritism. He does this for a reason. I think we'll see what that reason was. Again, he responded to the centurion. We know in John chapter 4, he responds to the Samaritan woman at the well. In fact, he actually goes up to talk to her, and she was like, why are you talking to me? Well, here is this Canaanite woman begging Jesus to heal her servant or heal her daughter who has this demon possession. Well, then in verse 25, she came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, help me. As they're going along, she's been following, and I guess at some point she's able to come right up to Jesus. And when it says she worshipped, it sounds like she bowed down at his feet and says, Lord, help me. His response in verse 26, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. Now, Jesus isn't calling Gentiles little dogs, but the analogy is such that what he has to give, which is the bread of life, was meant for the children at the table. It's not meant for the dogs, those who may not appreciate it. Because you would think that the Jews, the Israelites, they would appreciate it. They're the children. They should know and appreciate what they're being given. But then notice this woman's response. Verse 27, yes, Lord. She completely gets it. She understands exactly what Jesus is saying. But then she says, yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from the master's table. This woman, she's on it. She knows exactly what Jesus is talking about. You know, there are times where Jesus, he speaks in metaphor to relay some spiritual meaning, and it just goes, even the apostles at times just went right over their head. The Samaritan woman at the well was convinced Jesus was talking about physical water that I can drink and I'll never be thirsty again. That she couldn't comprehend the spiritual aspect of this. This woman doesn't miss a beat. Yes, Lord, I understand exactly what you're saying, but within your analogy, even the little dogs, sometimes those crumbs that the children eat fall off the table, and the little dogs get to eat that. Let me have one of those crumbs. That's what she's saying. Let me have one of those crumbs. I know you're sent to the children of Israel. I know that's your purpose. But even then, some of that is going to fall off the table to others. Jesus, in verse 28, he answered and said to her, O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire. And her daughter was healed from that very hour. It shivers up your spine to think that these are the only two times where Jesus refers to great faith and Jesus marvels. We find this regarding the unnamed Canaanite woman. I mean, oh, great is your faith. I mean, here in the account, we're not told that he marveled, but it says, great is your faith. I want you to think about that and how sad it is that this is the only two times in all of the Gospels that Jesus encountered anybody for whom he referred to as having great faith. Now, that's not to say there weren't other people who had great faith. Think about the woman who had the issue of blood and was convinced all she had to do was touch the hem of the garment of Jesus. Now, Jesus doesn't refer to great faith there, but certainly she had great conviction. But these two, and these two especially, I think are interesting. We have an unnamed centurion, Gentile. We have an unnamed Canaanite woman, Gentile. Both situations involve Jesus making a parallel or a comparison, or in really contrast, to the faith of Gentiles versus the faith of those who should have had it to start with, was Israel. And Jesus marveled at this woman. He marveled at the centurion. But let me share with you an example of one time when he marveled at the lack of faith. One time in the entire Gospels where he marveled, but this time at a lack of faith, and it happened in his own home. Notice with me Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 1. Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 1. We're told that Jesus went out from there and came to his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath had come, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many hearing him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? What wisdom is this which is given to him, that such mighty works are performed by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us?" And they were offended at him. When it says he went to his own country, he went to Nazareth. That's where he's at. He's back in Nazareth. He's gone home. And don't you remember this little boy running around? And we have his brothers here, we have his sisters here, we know who his mom and dad are. Where did all this come from? Remember, nothing good came out of Nazareth. Then in verse 4, Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house." It's an interesting statement by Jesus. In other places, a prophet receives honor because they recognize just how special that is, just how important that is. But in his own home, because people have certain perspective or certain view of that individual because they knew him from a wee lad, well, he's without honor in his own country, his own home. So then what do we find in verse 5? As Jesus is there in Nazareth, they know the mighty works because they referred to it back in the synagogue. How is it that this fella can do all these mighty works? Notice what Mark tells us. He could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. Verse 6, referring to Jesus, and he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went about the villages in a circuit teaching. Jesus marveled at their unbelief. Now this is literally the exact opposite of pistis, which is the term faith, conviction, persuasion. This is apisteo, the lack of conviction, the lack of persuasion. They had no belief. Now, Matthew's account, in chapter 13, verse 58, it's interesting because it says he could do no mighty work there. It's not that he wasn't capable of it. Matthew tells us he did not do. Why? Because what good would it have done? They don't have any faith. They don't have any belief. I mean, the works of God were supposed to confirm the Word, and the Word was supposed to bring about faith and conviction. But they're not willing to hear, they're not willing to listen. They're questioning everything he's doing and saying. All they can think about, all they can picture is this little boy who was raised among them. And so Jesus marvels because of their unbelief. We have two wonderful examples of great faith, great conviction and persuasion, such that we would do well to follow their example. We have one example of Jesus' own people from his own city and region of Nazareth who don't believe. And so Jesus didn't do many mighty works. He didn't do many miracles there because of their unbelief. So let me ask you a question. If something could be said about us, an example perhaps in a gospel, and there was some occasion on which Jesus encountered us 2,000 years ago, which category would we find ourselves in? Would we be one of the examples of great faith so much that Jesus marveled at our conviction and complete persuasion that he truly was the Son of God, that he had the power to wield of anything? Just say the word and it'll be done. Or would we be like his very own people, the very people who you would think should listen, would appreciate, and yet, because of their unbelief, Jesus didn't do any miracles among them, or not many among them. Which category would we be in? Put it another way. When it comes time for Judgment Day, we will all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, Paul tells us. Would Jesus be able to say to us, you have had great faith, great conviction? Or would he convict us for having unbelief? In Mark chapter 16 and in verse 14, the apostles were condemned by Jesus for the very same reason that he didn't do many miracles among the Nazarenes. In Mark chapter 16 and verse 14, Jesus appears to the apostles after he's risen from the dead. He appeared to the 11 as they sat at the table, and he rebuked their unbelief, the hardness of their hearts, because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. Now, a lot of the other accounts refer to Jesus, peace unto you, and refers to, him encouraging them and so forth. But Mark reminds us, keep in mind that not too long prior to this, they didn't believe. Even the reports that Jesus had been risen, they just kind of pushed it away. Jesus rebuked them. I think the King James says he upbraided them. In Romans chapter 11 and in verse 19, not an accident that we have here, again, a contrast between the Gentile and the Jew. And what does Paul say in verse 19? He's addressing the Gentile brethren in Rome, and he says in verse 19, you will say then branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said. Because of unbelief, they were grafted off. And you stand by faith. Notice the contrast. Due to a lack of faith, they were grafted out. You were grafted in because of your conviction and persuasion. But then he says at the end of verse 20, do not be haughty, but fear. Why? Verse 21, for if God did not spare the natural branches, the Jews, he may not spare you either. Therefore consider the goodness and the severity of God on those who fell severity, but towards you goodness. But notice the condition that has to be met in order to receive the goodness of God. First it was faith, conviction, persuasion. But then he says at the end of verse 22, if you continue in his goodness, otherwise you also will be cut off. The connection between faith and obedience. Just as James describes faith without works is dead, if I'm not willing to obey what the Lord tells me, I can claim to be convicted and persuaded all day long, but it's not real. Even the demons believe and they tremble, but they don't obey Jehovah. Faith must be mixed with belief, or faith must be mixed with obedience. We must do as the Father calls on us to do. That's why he says, if you continue in his goodness. That suggests a lifestyle, a walking, a way in which you conduct yourself. In Hebrews chapter 3 and in verse 7, the Hebrew writer in this context is actually speaking to faithful Jewish brethren, but he's contrasting them with Jewish people before who, due to lack of belief, didn't obey the Father. Verse 7 of Hebrews chapter 3, he says, therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tested me, tried me, and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was angry with that generation, and said, they always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Now the Hebrew writer takes that reference, he takes that Old Testament scripture, and what does he say? He applies it, verse 12. Beware, brethren, still speaking to these Jewish brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. The deceitfulness of sin. how it can trick us, how it can ensnare us. That's what he's describing. Verse 14, for we have become partakers of Christ if, notice the condition, if we hold the beginning of our confidence. That confidence goes back to that conviction, that persuasion, that faith in Christ Jesus. If we hold beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. While it is said, today if you'll hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. For who having heard rebelled? Indeed, was it not all who came out of Egypt led by Moses? With whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear they would not enter his rest? But to those who did not obey. Verse 19. So we see they could not enter in because of unbelief. Now, whoa. You just finished saying they couldn't enter his rest because they didn't obey. But at the very next verse, he says they didn't enter his rest because of unbelief. Well, which is it? It's both. Because if they were willing to believe, they should have been willing to obey. If they had the conviction, the persuasion that what God says goes, then I'm going to do what he tells me to do. But instead, they didn't. So they did not enter into his rest because they sinned. They didn't do what God told them to do. It's not that they didn't believe Jehovah was there. I mean, after the seas were parted, after manna came from heaven, after the water came out of rocks, after all the miracles, the pillar of fire and cloud and so forth, they knew Jehovah was there. But they didn't obey. Because their conviction, their persuasion was such that the Hebrew writer refers to it as unbelief because it was not mixed with obedience. We offer an invitation this morning to those who would seek heaven, to those who want to enter in to heaven one day. Do you want to enter into that rest? The very same rest that the Hebrew writer says continues to remain? I hope so. But what is needed is conviction and persuasion mixed with the willingness to obey what God tells us to do. That means repenting, confessing the Lord Jesus, and being baptized for the remission of our sins. Rising to live a faithful life after that. Those of us who are Christians, again, we ask ourselves this question. As of right now, with my soul state, whatever state it's in, would Jesus be able to refer to my great faith, my conviction, persuasion, my trust in him, my willingness to obey him? Or would he put me in the same category as these Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 3? Those who knew God was there, I know he's there, but I'm just not willing to do what he tells me to do. I'll give him part of me, but not all of me. What did the Hebrew writer warn about? The deceitfulness of sin. If you need help in any way, please come forward as we stand and sing.